As usual, we'll start off with the Pledge of Allegiance, and I would like to invite Dylan Kreiner to step up for us. For those of you who don't know Dylan, he's the youngest buck sergeant in the room. He's also a World War II enthusiast, and he's been learning a lot, and he's a great addition to our group here. And I'll tell you a little bit about him, courtesy of his folks. Dylan was born at an early age. In October 2004. He lives in Palmyra with his very proud parents, Mike and Donna, and his younger brother Logan. He has 2 dogs, Harley and Winter, named after Dick Winters. 2 cats, Tom and Jerry, and a parakeet named Mikey. He's an A student, wouldn't you know? I don't know many of them. A student in the 3rd grade class at Lingle Elementary School in Palmyra. He enjoys playing baseball, where he should be right now, but he's here instead. Fishing and watching the Pittsburgh Penguins and Pirates, which is kind of a personal problem. We'll talk about that. He loves history and learning about World War II by going to the roundtable meetings with his Aunt Sharon. There's Sharon. Hi, Sharon. And Pat. That's also Pop over there, Pat. He especially enjoys meeting the veterans and listening to their stories. He wrote the following in his November writing journal at school. And before I read that, I'm going to tell Dylan, you know now we're putting ID tags on our World War II veterans. So please, if Dylan comes up and asks you a couple of questions too, please honor him with an answer. Okay? He writes, my responsibility at home. One of my responsibilities at home is learning about World War II. To most people, that's not a responsibility, but to me it is. Because hundreds, if not thousands, of World War II vets die every day. Someday there won't be any left, so when that day comes, I can tell their stories to everyone. So with that in mind, Dylan, would you? Dylan's going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Dylan. Good job. Cell phones, please turn them off. Does everybody have hearing enhancement who needs one? What?
Does anybody need help with their...
If not, we'll try to yell at you. Do we have any first-timers in the house? No? Well, yeah, welcome. That tells me there weren't many, which tells me also that those of you who aren't first-timers, please invite somebody to come next month. We enjoy first-comers, and they usually become second-comers. So, as you can see, our body is growing nicely. We'd like to fill this place up. So, bring a friend. Is anybody not getting a notification of the meetings? If you're not getting a notification, please, in the back. Okay. Please come see Rich Burton. We'd like to get you on either the email or the mailing list. Now, speaking of notifications, as you know, the church has a dinner that they prepare for us. Not just for us, for anybody, but you're supposed to call and make reservations. One of the problems they're having is so many of our people call the church and say, I want to have dinner, and by the way, is the round table going to be this, that, the other thing? Is the author going to bring books? Is a whole bunch of other questions that the church doesn't know the answer to. They're not involved in this function. They provide us this nice hall to have our meetings. But, so therefore, again, call Rich Burton. His number is on the communications that go out. Please channel your communication to him and try to take the burden off the church if they're going nuts. They have several other organizations who use this facility as well, and they're getting calls from all sorts of people, and they're going crazy, so let's not burden them. Let's be a good tenant. Thank you. Where'd the hat go? No, that's my hat. They took it? All right. Apparently the lost hat is found. What else we got here? Rich Burton, like to say something about the Vietnam Roundtable?
For those of you that don't know, there's a Vietnam Roundtable, and this meets at 8000 Dairy Street, and we meet the following Thursday from tonight, so it's May the 8th, and we're going to have Walt Hooper, who was in the Americal Division, the 198th Regiment, so he is this month. Next month, we have Gump May, who was the former Hershey High School football coach. He was in the Marines in Vietnam. So Walt Hooper is this month from the Americal, and Gump May is next month, and he was in the Marine Corps. And we'll meet at the Vietnam Veterans Center down on 8000 Dairy Street in Harrisburg. And if you have any questions, you can come and see me.
Thanks, Rich. A couple of other things. May 17th and 18th, that's a couple of weekends from now, over at the Army Heritage Center in Carlisle. They will be having Army Heritage Days. They'll have all kinds of classes and things for sale and exhibitions and whatnot, and it's free. So if you have nothing better to do, or can't think of anything better to do, go on over to Carlisle and partake of the Army Heritage Days. Rick, did you want to talk about you all heard about the World War II Museum down in New Orleans. We have a terrific opportunity that they've called and presented us with, which Rick McCann will tell you about.
Thank you. Echo on what Rich said about Vietnam. If you can make that, I don't know the gentleman next week, but the June one with Gumby, I coached with him for 15 years, so he is a very good speaker. He was in Marine Force Recon, heavy combat. He was a Marine Corps captain, so you want to see a guy, and he's a good storyteller, so you'll enjoy him and he's fun. But as you know, we've been working on oral histories with the United States Army Heritage and Education Foundation, and some of you gentlemen last year gave us your names, phone numbers, information, and some of you have been interviewed with Steph Chartenoff's high school students right here from Belleville. We got a new opportunity, which is really pretty cool. The gentleman that works for the National World War II Museum, which is in New Orleans, and he has one of the great jobs, I think, of all time. He gets to travel around the country paid to interview World War II veterans. And he got in contact with us through the roundtable and would like to do that with some of you gentlemen or ladies here with us tonight. Those of you that signed up on that original list is what I'd like to pass on to him, but I didn't want to do that until you knew who you were going to call from, or to tell me you didn't want to call from the National World War II Museum. It's a great opportunity, again, to tell your story. It's a very comprehensive program they put together, and that would be a great benefit for future generations if you could do that. What I'll do is handle it this way. If you're on that list, if you remember, and signed up, if you don't tell me that, if you back out of that, I'll honor that, of course. If you don't talk to me today, I'm going to pass those names and numbers to this gentleman, who will then contact you and come here if we could get a number of you together at the same time. He'd fly up from New Orleans and do some interviews. It wouldn't be the same as what we've done with the AHAC group and Steph's students, so it'll be a whole different kind of interview if you've already been interviewed. But so I think it was a great opportunity for you to, like I said, share your story for the future. Guys like Dylan.
And of course, we got some of your names tonight to give you name tags. If you don't want to be contacted, please let us know. Otherwise, this is a tremendous opportunity for the Army Museum down in New Orleans, and they'd love to chat with you. They're going to come all up here, schedule meetings, and they're not going to be long, but they will be important. The honor bus leaves on May 4th. I hope some of you are taking advantage of it. I don't know if there's any more room on it or not, but if you want to, called Becky Lacey. If you need to know how to call her, ask me. It's a wonderful organization. Two more things. On a down note, John Roush, who was one of our former speakers, C-47 co-pilot, talked to us. He passed away the day before our last meeting, so thanks to him. And finally, I'll remind you that we have a very robust helmet committee who will be standing by the doors on the way out. We encourage you to visit them. We don't charge for these meetings, but we will collect if you'd like to donate. Thank you very much. Last month's attendance was right about 150, which isn't bad. I think we're going to do that tonight as well. Next month we have Stuart Robinson talking to us. He was on the Hornet, USS Hornet during World War II, and I'm sure he has lots of great pictures and lots of interesting stories to tell. July we have Hallstown own Dick Brown, who was on Iwo Jima, who lives right here in town, so that'll be interesting as well. As usual, we need a little help for the rest of the year. August, we could certainly use anybody. Any one of you World War II vets would like to talk to us. We'd love to hear from you. I know you get stories. You've heard them here. This isn't a high-pressure situation, and I bet you on your own you could sit down and talk for 45 minutes without even sweating. So we would encourage you to do that, and we should come forth. Okay. Getting back to the month of May, a few short notes about May. As you know, World War II ended in May, but before that, a lot of things happened. Before the war, and this sort of plays into what our speaker tonight will tell us, because he'll tell us a lot about what happened building up to the war, and then some other things about the Americans getting into the war, etc. But just for a little background news, on May 10th, Winston Churchill became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom upon the resignation of Neville Chamberlain. And at that time, Belgium declared a state of emergency. Churchill was called upon to form a wartime coalition government. And right about then, the massive German offensive against the Western Front happened. The invasion of Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France begins. And in a bold stroke, German paratroopers, which actually came in by glider, captured the Belgian fort at Evon-Emel, which is not a very well-known story, but we went there a couple years ago on one of Laura's tours. It was just a fantastic piece of history. So, Luxembourg was taken over. Churchill actually offered the former Kaiser Wilhelm II, who is now in the Netherlands, he offered him asylum in the United Kingdom, but he declined it. In their own defense, the Belgians blew up all the bridges over the Meuse River to halt the German advance, but it didn't do a whole lot of good because by the end of May, Germany had occupied Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and they all surrendered. On the other side of the world, the Japanese heavily bombed the national capital in China at Chongqing on the upper Yangtze River. And that started things cooking over there pretty hot. So, having said that, Henry Gohl, our speaker, the author of several books, one of which is Exposing the Third Reich, the story about military Germany leading up to the war inside the Reich. He's a former Green Beret, an instructor at the Army War College, a combat veteran of both Korea and Vietnam. And we're looking forward to what he has to say. So may I introduce to you, please, Henry Gohl.
It is alleged that this works. Does it work with you? Yes. You hear me? She's been supervising me for 57 years, so she can do that tonight as well. Thanks for inviting me. I must admit that I plead ignorance. I didn't know there was a World War II roundtable. I was well aware of the Civil War roundtable because of Dr. Richard Summers, who's a friend of mine, and one of the major figures in that organization. It's a Western Front organization, but I'm quite pleased now to know that there's a World War II roundtable. I was asked to say something about me. Now, that should be easy enough. Born 1933, New York City, parochial schools, Catholic prep school, off to college. The war in Korea was going on, and I wanted to be the Audie Murphy of the 3 and 4 with a Medal of Honor, and then go on to some indeterminate great things later on in my life. I was an enlisted soldier from 52 to 54. I was the VA Army and the medic in Korea. I left the Army in 1954, intending never again to darken the Army's doorway. I got a bachelor's degree at Hofstra College, 1957, master's degree at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, 1958, and I took a high school in Baldwin, New York. That's on Long Island, about 30 miles from Manhattan, for 3 years, taught English for a year, and history for 2. I was in my 3rd year when a man named John F. Kennedy made a speech, his inaugural address, and he said he needed me. I literally dropped what I was doing, called the little ladies in the tennis shoes, first Army headquarters at the time, and found my way back to the Army, this time as an officer. I got a direct regular Army commission in 1961. A lot of people in this room will remember that people responded in the way I did, both to the military, to the Peace Corps, to register black voters down south. It was a very inspirational time, and I was duly impressed by our young president. Down to Fort Benning, did some training down there, over to Germany, winding up with the 10th Special Forces Group in Bad Tölz, Germany. After that, back to schools. I've been to, in the military, I think most of you know, there's a basic course and a career course and staff colleges and war colleges and so that sort of thing. I did all that. Plus, I did the German language course, and I was sent to Stanford University for a 3rd master's degree, which is about as useful as 3 eyes. But the fact is that I prepared myself to be an attaché in Germany, which I did later. But before that happened, I went to Vietnam. I was with 5th Special Forces Group, 66, 67. Then I was the German Foreign Area Officer, trained for that, at which time I was returned to Vietnam, this time with the MACV Saab, with the best soldiers I've ever served with, the recon men who went to Cambodia and Laos on exceedingly dangerous missions. It was a kind of outfit where there were 100 Americans and about 1,000 little people, indigenous people of various types, Chinese gums, Montagnards, Vietnamese. And when we had a rare formation there, it was usually for a KIA, I would be standing in ranks with 2 Medal of Honor winners out of 100 Americans, and not to mention DSCs and Silver Stars and all that sort of thing. The highlights, aside from a couple of combat tours, were to be attaché, I was the Assistant Army Attaché in Bonn from 1973 to 77. I was a teacher of history at West Point, 1977 to 1980. Then I went off to the War College, the Strategic Studies Institute, did another gig in Germany, in Kaiserslautern, came back to the War College, where I taught, and retired in 1988. I've been scribbling since 1988. I published 4 books. The first one was about war planning at the War College. It was my dissertation in 1991 and was made into a book in 2003. I'd like to touch on 3 topics tonight about which I've done some research and writing. One is planning at the Army War College before the Second World War. Secondly, a few comments about ground combat in Europe during the Second World War, how initially incompetent much of our leadership was, and how our army in Europe between June of 44 and May of 45 learned the hard way by dying, and became a very good army and combat arms by the time the war was over, at which time, of course, we got rid of that army. The third point I'd like to discuss has to do with Charles Lindbergh, who was used by the army attaché in Berlin to penetrate the Luftwaffe. Let me turn to, is that me doing that? by committing some sin, according to the instrument you gave me. This Road to Rainbow, the proper title is Army Planning for Global War, 1934 to 1940. I did the research at the military, mostly at the Military History Institute, Carlisle Barracks, and focused on the period 1934 to 1940 for a couple of reasons that will become obvious. How's that? I have to read it. The book is based primarily upon curricular archives at the Army War College between the years 1919 and 1940. But I focus on 34 to 40 in my book. And tonight I'd like to tell you about just two of the plans. In 1934, a plan was made for war with Japan called Orange. At this time, the color plans at the War College were various. Green was Mexico, crimson was Canada, orange was Japan, black was Germany, red was Britain, and so forth and so on. Orange had its origins in American success in the Spanish-American War, which put us in the Philippines in 1898. This was rapidly followed by a successful war of the Japanese against the Russians in 1904-1905, which meant that the U.S. Navy anticipated one day the U.S. Navy would collide with the Japanese Navy, which was becoming the regional power in the Western Pacific. After the First World War, a number of German colonies, the Carolinas, the Marshalls, the Marianas, were taken from Germany and given to the Japanese as mandated positions by the League of Nations. This meant they weren't supposed to fortify there, but they were supposed to babysit those islands. From 1919 to 1940, the U.S. Navy incessantly prepared for war with Japan. That was pretty much their reason for being. In 1933, something happened at the Naval War College. The students, in effect, rebelled against their faculty, convincing the faculty that a long thrust by the U.S. Navy into the Western Pacific, vicinity of Asian mainland and Japan, was unwise because we didn't know what was in the Marianas, we didn't know what was in those islands that the Japanese were occupying and probably fortified. The students said, we don't want to risk our fleet. We don't know what they have in the way of fast boats, aircraft, land-based aircraft, bases, and so forth. And they convinced the faculty of the wisdom of what the students had to say. By the way, if you ever have to do any research, do it with the Navy or the Air Force. They treat you much better than the Army does. As a retired colonel, I was treated like royalty by the U.S. Navy. The students convinced the faculty convinced the president of the Naval War College, Reed, Commandant in Army language, and the Commandant sent the captain to Washington, convinced the chief of naval operations that it was unwise to project the fleet across that ocean. The safer course would be to establish bases and move incrementally across the Pacific. A member of the Naval War College class of 1933 was Admiral William F., then Captain William F. Halsey. Halsey completed the Naval War College in 1933. In 1934, he was a student at the Army War College, where he influenced his classmates who were doing the plan to fight Japan. Simply expressed, the Army students, by the way, I should say something about the War College then. The class of 1934 consisted of 84 people, 4 naval officers, 2 U.S. Marines, and the rest were Army. The Army War College in those days was in Washington, D.C. Right now we have Fort McNair. And Fort McNair was just a short trolley ride to the State Department, the War Department, the Navy Department, all of which were housed in the same building, a short trolley car ride away from the War College. At the end of each war plan done by a group, there was a meeting in a plenary session in a room much like this one. Faculty, staff, and the Commandant of the U.S. Army War College. There would be a briefing by the students, and then there would be a Q&A period in which the Commandant very often actively engaged. When the War Plan Orange, 1934, Army War College, was briefed to the student body, there was a great deal of chagrin and dismay, because what this meant was, and every officer in the room knew it, this meant that the fleet could not get to the Philippines in time to relieve the Americans who were in the Philippines. A lot of the students in the class of 1934 had served in the Philippines. They had brothers-in-law, cousins, and friends, and buddies, and classmates in the Philippines, and they expressed a great deal of discontent. But the fact of the matter was that the Philippines would have to wait until the progress across the Pacific was made. The plan, very briefly, the plan in 1933, the Army War College, was precisely what happened from 1942 on after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Excuse me, I have a nasal drip and I have to keep drinking this water. The plan, as briefed, but the Navy 1933, Army 1934, was just before the War of the Pacific was fought. There was another plan that I want to tell you about, 1935. This is the Commandant at the War College at the time was a very sophisticated, experienced guy who had done a lot of interesting things. Effectively, he created something called participation with allies. That is, coalition warfare. He foresaw that the United States would be fighting as a part of a coalition against an enemy coalition. Until that time, it was pretty much one-on-one. The U.S. versus Orange, Japan. The U.S. versus Mexico, green. The U.S. versus Canada, long frontier. There was no trouble with them, that's a long frontier. So there were war plans. In 1935, a plan was made called the Nazi Confederation, to fight the Nazi Confederation. In this configuration, the United States would be part, 1935, part of an alliance, fighting the Germans who would lead an alliance, which looked very much like the alignment to the First World War, Britain and France on one side, the U.S. with them, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and so forth on the other side. The interesting thing about this plan was, because of what was going on at the time, it was very difficult for me, and very difficult for the students, to sort out what was scenario and what was in the daily newspapers, because of what was going on in Europe and what was going on in Japan. As the students prepared to fight this Nazi Confederation, was the name of it, in 1935, they looked over their shoulder and said, you know, we may be going to war with Japan. In fact, they started to think about a war, a simultaneous war with Germany and Japan in 1935. I make a big fuss of this because until the publication of this book, as a matter of fact, the accepted historical wisdom about preparation for the war that became World War II was pegged in the year 1940, when a decision was made considering war with Japan and war with Germany at the same time. What should be done? It was a matter of sorting out priorities, and the decision made in 1940 was Germany first. The attempt would be made to defeat Germany first and then turn to Japan. In fact, that's precisely what the students in 1935 concluded when they considered the war with Germany and Japan. Very prescient, very good planning. I think the folk wisdom about American preparedness for the Second World War had soldiers running around with wooden rifles, totally unprepared, totally unsurprised, until the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. We all sang, praise the Lord, pass the ammunition, the country mobilized, cranked up the factories which had been quiet during the Depression, poured goods, built the Liberty ship every week, and a tank every day, and amazing industrial output to win the Second World War. Not quite. The Army was very small at the period I'm describing. During the 1930s, the Army was 140,000 strong. About 1923, after the big surge of the First World War, until just before the Second World War, it leveled out for about a dozen years at 140,000. The Army was small, excellent school system. These officers, in fact, were those serving an army that was called small, inept, incapable, and so forth and so on. People in the army at the time, however, were not bereft of brains, and they made some super plans. I just want to read a short quotation from Admiral Chester Nimitz, who shortly after the war, Second World War, said, quote, "The war with Japan had been reenacted in the gate rooms at the Naval War College by so many people and in so many different ways that nothing that happened during the war was a surprise, absolutely nothing, except the kamikaze tactics toward the end of the war. We had not visualized these." So good for the planets of Orange and the Nazi Confederation. Why was this the folk wisdom? I said the folk wisdom was we didn't really get geared up until about 1940. Why was that the case? It just so happens that the curricular archives of the Army War College were mislocated. Substitute? Is that a better way to go? And you can just turn up the power back there. And you keep, how's this? I'm sure what else will figure this out.
Looks like it looks good. Here we go.
I do electric light bulbs not to the extent of my talent set. Lydia, can you hear me? Ooh. Lydia, can you hear me? Is that okay? The Army War College shut its doors in 1940. It did not open, we can talk about that if you'd like during the Q&A. It did not reopen until 1950. There was no War College for 10 years. When it opened at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas for 1 year. And then in 1951, it moved to its current location in Carlisle Barracks, the Army War College at Carlisle Barracks. In the years immediately after the Second World War, the official history was written in a series of books, the U.S. Army in World War II, the War Department. These are commonly in the history racket, they're commonly known as the Green Books. And there's about 10 linear feet of them. The one I'm holding in my hand is Chief of Staff, Pre-War Plans and Preparations. It was published in 1950. A number of the Green Books were published in 51, 52, 53. The archives, the curricular archives of the Army War College, were found by a historian from the Center for Military History in 1957, after the Green Books, the most authoritative source we had, were written. Therefore, these books were not available to the people writing the official history. I stumbled upon the curricular archives while doing research and developed that book. But, it isn't because the historians were dull-witted, they just didn't have the sources that I did. My second book is called Soldiering. The proper title is Observations of Korea, Vietnam, and Safe Places. I won't say anything about it, but buy one or two, they're small. My next book was at the request of the son of William E. Depew. My Depew book deals almost entirely with the formation of William E. Depew. The title of the book is Preparing the Army for the Modern War. Depew was very much formed in the Second World War, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But the point of the book is that Depew is the one man most responsible for fixing the broken post-Vietnam U.S. Army. Most of the people in this room were around. The Army was a wreck in the aftermath of the war in in Vietnam, and William Depew fixed it. Depew, I can give you a sketch of his life. We could do that in the Q&A if you'd like to know more about him. But he was, I actually met him a couple of times, and of course his son commissioned me to write the book. I interviewed many of his colleagues, people like General Starry, who could have been credited with fixing the army that I just described. But in interviewing him, I said, General, I'm beginning to conclude that William Depew, Bill Depew, fixed my broken army. And he says, I accept that. Paul Gorman, another man who could be credited with fixing our broken army, said to me it was Bill Depew. He did it. Without him, it would have taken another 10 years. But with him, it was done very rapidly. Most of you in this room probably know that the United States Army, in the early days of the war, was not a very good army. Kasserine Pass in North Africa, then into Sicily, the slugging match in Italy. The least desirable thing you want to do as an infantry officer is to assault a hilltop every day with German soldiers on it. And that's where the Italian campaign was fought. The early days of the war on the continent in June, July of 1944, the Army did not cover itself with glory. I described very poor leadership, the kind of poor leadership that my protagonist, William E. Depew, enjoyed or suffered under. At the age of 25, he had successfully commanded an Army infantry battalion in combat. He had gone through the mill, one Distinguished Service Cross at the time, 3 Silver Stars, 2 Purple Hearts. And at the age of 25, at the end of the war, he was a Division G3. A Division G3 is, in our contemporary Army, is probably the best 41-year-old lieutenant colonel you have, 42-year-old. And at the age of 25, Bill Depew was the G3. Some of you may know of him. He was notorious for relieving people of command. He was a very contentious figure. He was despised. He frightened more people than any other general in the Army at the time, probably. Those who worked closest with him were devoted to him and thought he was first rate. But I wanted just to point out how bad things were in the winter of 1944-45. It was a brutal winter, very wet, very cold, and theater-wide there were people suffering, not just Depew. General Patton put out this on 21 November 1944, quote, "The most serious menace confronting us today is not the German army, but the weather, which, if we do not exert ourselves, may well destroy us through the incidents of trench foot. To win the war, we must conquer trench foot." In the entirety of World War II, American air and ground forces suffered 91,000 cold weather injuries. Between November 44 and April 45, hospitals in Europe admitted 45,283. In other words, half of all the cold weather injuries suffered in the Second World War were suffered between November 44 and April 45. The American decision to fight the war with 89 divisions meant that instead of rotating large units, a pipeline provided individual replacements. Intense combat in the European theater of operations produced casualties overwhelmingly among riflemen in squads and platoons. The veteran soldiers in here know that's the way it is. First World War, 85% of the casualties were in the infantry. In the Second World War, 85% were infantry. In the Korean War, 85% were infantry. I don't have figures for Vietnam, and I don't know how we're faring in Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of branch. But one veteran said, quote, "There was no way out except KIA, WIA, or war over. These guys would just bent forward until they died or were wounded. From 1 July to October 44, the 9th Infantry Division lost 17,900 some odd men, 18,000 men, of whom about 3,000 returned to duty. This meant that the division lost more than 100% of its TO&E, table of organization and equipment strength. So the bad leadership I alluded to, the terrible weather conditions, and the losses that were taken largely in the infantry. The last point I'll make before we go to some Q&A about any of this would be exposing the Third Reich. This is my latest book. It's a fact book. Colonel Truman Smith in Hitler's Germany. I'll give you a thumbnail sketch of Smith. He was a patrician, Connecticut. His ancestors had just missed the Mayflower, settled much of Massachusetts and Connecticut. His grandfather, a namesake, was Truman Smith, was a senator from Connecticut. The Truman Smith I wrote about was Yale, 1915, Mexican frontier, 1916, France, 1917-18. Koblenz to occupy Germany. He went to Germany, he went to Europe, loving the French, not thinking much of Germans. He soon despised the French and liked the Germans very much. But that's not the point of my yarn today. I want to tell you about Lindbergh, a very quirky man who got a very bad reputation that was based upon rumors rather than facts. Short story. It's 1936. Truman Smith is attaché in Berlin in Hitler's Germany. Hitler's been in power for 3 years. For the first 2 years, he consolidates power. Starting at home, domestic power. He purges his party and so forth and so on. In 1935, in a series of speeches called the Saturday Surprises, he announced, one, Germany was going to go to conscription and increase the army from 100,000 to 555,000, 36 divisions. On another Saturday surprise, this is in March of 1935, he said he has a Luftwaffe and he's going to build a damn good one. All of this was in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Europe did nothing about it. In 1936, he reoccupies the Rhineland. Nobody does anything about it. And this sets him on his course that eventually leads to the shooting war starting on September 1939. In 1936, one morning in a marvelous apartment in the most elite part of Berlin, Smith's wife, Truman Smith's wife, Kay, said, "Oh, look at this, Lindbergh's in Paris," to her husband, the army attaché. Smith thinks that over, and later on in the day, he's inspired and says, "I'm going to contact Lindbergh and ask him to come to Germany." Long story short, he writes a letter, he sends it to the British attaché in, the American attaché in London. The message is passed to Lindbergh. Lindbergh accepts. Truman, on his own initiative, goes to a German buddy. By the way, this is very significant. Smith had lots of close, very close, lifelong German friends. That didn't make him an option, made him even big. He'd been in Germany since 1919. He left from Koblenz, he went to Berlin from 1920 to 1924. He's back in Berlin 1935 to 1939 as attaché. He had lots of German friends. He goes to one of his buddies, and his buddy was the guy in what they call the attaché referat, the place that controls the attachés. And he says, "How would you like to have Lindbergh come over?" He said, "Could you make that happen?" And Smith said, "I could make that happen." He says, "Let me run this up the flagpole." Smith goes back to the embassy. Within hours, he gets a call from his German friend. says, it's been run by Garrett, they want this to happen. Let's talk. So Smith goes back the next day, and he says, here's the deal. If Lindbergh comes, I want him to have unlimited access to all construction, aircraft construction facilities, experimental facilities, the aircraft themselves, and the ones that are in service and the ones that are coming online. Furthermore, I want it to be with Lindbergh when he does this, and I want my air attaché to be with us. The in-between goes back to German higher headquarters, and they come back and said, okay, if Lindbergh attends the 1936 Olympics, Summer Olympics in Berlin, and that was a deal that was made. If Lindbergh would show up at the Olympics in 1936 in Berlin, Lindbergh would have access to everything. Well, I think many of you know, I think there are pictures of him sitting in the cockpit of the Messerschmitt 109, every German fighter aircraft, all the bombers, transportation aircraft, and so forth and so on. And he and Smith and the air attaché sat down every day and made notes, all of which went back to Washington. This is in effect, we have a former attaché in the room. This was one of the most outstanding intel coups known to man or beast. We knew everything about the Luftwaffe. Okay. Lindbergh returns 4 times to Germany. The Germans offered to build him a house in Berlin, so he would live there. He'd been living in France and Britain. If you remember, his baby was kidnapped and murdered. He and his wife left in New Jersey. He and his wife left the country, lived in France, lived in Britain, were treated around the world as very important persons. Whenever he showed up in a capital, the embassy would house him for the duration of his stay. He was a very important human being because of his fight across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927. He was a real hero. He was also a very quirky, freakish man. A couple of examples. One, Truman and Kay Smith visit England. They're picked up by Lindbergh and his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, a very prolific and super writer. I'll tell you about her later. When Smith hops in the back of the car, he checks the London Times. Lindbergh, who's driving, turns around, puts a cigarette lighter to the newspaper he's reading, and up it goes. His wife tells Kay Smith he's done this before. On another occasion, they're in the Eiffel Tower, the Smiths and the Lindberghs, and the Lindberghs have a little boy, he's about 4 or 5 years old. As they're coming down, Truman Smith picks up the little boy because he's exhausted, and Charles Lindbergh says, oh no, put him down. He has to be a real man. Of course, he was a little baby boy. On another occasion, at table, the little baby boy is working with a sharp knife, and the Smith said, this is great, he's going to cut himself. Well, he has to. This is the kind of behavior Lindbergh demonstrated in the presence of the Smiths. They became very good friends, by the way. In 1939, well, before that, Lindbergh was disenchanted with the Germans after Kristallnacht, when the Germans literally broke all of the glass windows of Jewish shops all over Germany, and the pogrom begins, concentration camps, and all that sort of thing. Lindbergh, to his credit, says, I couldn't live in that country. And he goes back to the States, where, by the way, initially he's a colonel in the U.S. Army, very briefly. Smith is given a physical examination for promotion to lieutenant colonel in 1939 in the embassy in Berlin. The doctor is sent there for this purpose, and it turns out that he has diabetes. That didn't mean much to Smith at the time, because he knew German officers, senior officers, who had diabetes who were still serving. But in the U.S. Army, he didn't know this. It required medical discharge by regulation. You just couldn't have diabetes to be a serving officer. He goes back to the States. The medics look him over at Walter Reed, and the paperwork is all drawn up for his medical discharge. when George Marshall, who's then Chief of Staff, and he's been Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army since September 1st, 1939, takes the files, puts them in his file cabinet where they stayed. Smith was the outstanding expert on things German at the time. And Marshall was damned if he was going to let his most knowledgeable officer about things German lead the Army. 2 years later, in the summer of 1941, when there was a protest by a senior officer, a reserve officer or a National Guard officer, complained to Marshall, "You're cleaning house, you're chasing away the reservists, the National Guard officers, and you're protecting this Smith, who's a regular Army officer, who by regulation should be bounced from the Army." Marshall, by the way, was firing regular Army officers too. If you were fat, dumb, or stupid, you were gone. If you were old and not with it, you were gone. He saw what the Germans had done, and he was aware of what the Japanese could do. He had served, by the way, in China, and knew that Marshall had. And he was very well aware of the fact that a lot of the senior officers of the U.S. Army just couldn't stand up to combined arms and rapid warfare. And so he was firing people left and right. So he calls Smith into his office and he says, "Smith, I'm going to have to send you home." Now, they were friends. He always called him Smith, always, in writing, Smith, dear Smith. "I'm going to have to send you home. My hand has been caught in a till. I can't protect it any longer. I regret it, but you have to go home." So Smith goes back to Connecticut. In about September of 1941, when the bombs fall on Pearl Harbor, Smith gets a call in Connecticut, Fairfield, Connecticut, and it's Marshall, and he says, "Smith, I want you to come back to Washington. Will you come?" And Smith says, "I never wanted to leave." So he returns. This is some of the intricacy inside baseball now. Smith was a regular Army officer. He left the Army to retire medically as a lieutenant colonel. That took him off the regular Army list. When he was called back, he was put on, effectively, the reserve list and promoted to colonel. So he wasn't held against the regular Army pecking order, which was very carefully monitored by regular Army officers, the way teachers look at their tenure. In any event, Smith goes back to Washington, and while he's in Washington, he serves Marshall for the rest of the war as his German expert. But from by the way, I mentioned Anne Morrow Lindbergh. I strongly recommend, if you care at all about the events that I'm describing, Lindbergh, War Within and Without, Diaries and Letters, 1939, 1941, good stuff. For a broader look at what's going on, 1939, 1941, a book that was just published by Lynn Olson, published last year in 2013. Those Angry Days, Roosevelt, Lindbergh, and America's Fight over World War II, 1939, 1941. The fight between the interventionists and the non-interventionists was at least as volatile as what we see in Washington now, probably much worse. Lindbergh was for non-intervention. That is, after September 1st, 1939, and then into 1940, when the Germans moved from Norway to all of Western Europe, which we heard about at the beginning of this session, when that takes place, there were Americans who wanted to side with the French and the British. There were other Americans who, for various reasons, wanted to bring down Hitler and the Germans. And these were the interventionists. Roosevelt, FDR, is generally considered in that camp. Lindbergh was opposed to that. He said the Europeans screw up every 20 years. They screwed up 1914, 1918. We went over there. The Americans, by and large, you call it isolationism if you want. You can call it buyer's regret. But there was a lot of regret about American involvement in the First World War through the 20s and the 30s. Let's not do that again, said the non-interventionists. Lindbergh made speeches all around the country, and his speeches were tasteless and stupid, and his wife warned him. That's why I recommend those letters and diaries. He's preparing a speech on one occasion, and she said, "Can I sing it?" And she said, "Sure." She says, "You can't say that." I think it was at Madison Square Garden or some other big place. "You can't say that. The day after the speech, they're going to call you anti-Semitic. They're going to call you pro-Nazi. You can't do that. He does precisely that. And the next day, they call him pro-Nazi, anti-Semitic, and so forth and so on. Here was a guy who was magic around aircraft, but a really unique, unusual case, a babe in the woods in the world of politics. In any event, he was labeled Nazi. Well, all of that goes away after December 1941, when the bombs fall on Pearl Harbor. Many of you in this room remember, I remember vividly, I was 8 years old, and I remember the guys coming back with the shiniest boots I ever saw. Gene Kramer, 101st Airborne, shiniest shoes I ever saw in the whole world. It was something called the paratroopers. Praise the Lord and passed the ammunition. All the local boys went away. The blue stars went up in the windows. And when the boys were killed, the gold stars went up in the windows. It was all very exciting. When I went to the movies, I sang patriotic songs and watched the bouncing ball. And we were all hyper Americans and engaged in the war. Both Smith, who was painted with the same brush as Lindbergh, and Lindbergh are vindicated in the course of the war. All the crap and nonsense about being pro-Nazis and all that stuff goes away for a bunch of reasons. I want you to have some time for Q&A, so why don't I just stop there? Do you have any questions about either the war planning, the inept leadership in Europe, the casualties, the weather in that year, or any questions about Lindbergh, the Army? Yes, sir.
Did you just,
I'm also deaf, by the way.
did you just consider the higher up officers to be inept?
Let's try this again.
Hello?
Hello?
Basically, Greg is 80 years old.
Did you just consider the higher up officers, the colonels, the generals, to be inept, not the ones serving in the field?
Is the question was, did I find those people inept?
The higher ups, the generals, the colonels.
Absolutely. In the Pew book, the first 65 pages, by the way, are spent. The first 65 pages of the book are spent in Europe. The Pew had one regimental commander, and he rarely used profanity. He said, the goddamnedest horse's ass known to man or beast, and the guy was relieved. He had two regimental commanders relieved before they found a very good one, a very, very good one, as a matter of fact. He served under 3 different division commanders in the first months in Europe. The first 2 were relieved. Bradley and Eisenhower were seriously considering turning the 90th Division into replacements because they were so inept. There were people fired left, right, and center. If you'd like to read something about this, Tom Ricks wrote a book called The Generals, and it is his thesis that in the Second World War, we relieved people left and right if they couldn't do the job, and since then, we have been very careful about relieving senior officers. Generally speaking, at the Army, Field Army Corps division level, down to regiment, the people were relieved and substitutes were sent in their place. And at the battalion level, the very good lieutenants, the very good captains, people like the Pew, became the battalion commanders at the age of 25 or 26 or 27. So yes, the Army was a pretty poor organization. And remember, in the interwar period, there wasn't much experience with field training exercises and that sort of thing. I told you that the Army was at 140,000. It was very, it was badly paid. I described the officers who went to all the schools and did the great things. there were others who played polo, drank whiskey, martinis, and let Milt Gordon run the company in Hawaii and from here to eternity, and Captain Holmes was doing other things, worrying about boxing or whatever he was worrying about. Yes, the people at the top of the heap, a lot of them were inept. And by the way, an organization like this, I should think you'd really want to read Rick Atkinson's trilogy on the Second World War. First book is North Africa, second book is Sicily and into Italy, and the third book is from Normandy to the end of the war. Extraordinary book, beautiful writing, lots of detail, great stuff. I commend it to you. So,
We talked about the number of divisions in the Army and the decision to replace casualties as opposed to more divisions. Can you tell us, once they saw that they were having so high fatalities with replacements, why did they
the plan, first of all, 1940, the decision made in real world, not a scenario, was Germany first, then the more greater threat, then we'll take care of Japan. I lost track of what I was. I just lost track.
basically the Marshall decision?
Oh, yeah. You can replace it one of two ways. You can take a battalion and replace a battalion with a fresh battalion, a regiment, a division, and this has been done. But we had a pipeline system. Have you ever seen the film Battleground? Maybe the best visual depiction of infantry close combat in Europe in the Second World War. A lot of the replacements would come up and die before the squad leader knew their name. It was the individual replacement system. In my debut book, there are times when a company has 7 men or 12 men, and a batch come in. On one occasion, when Depew got his good regimental commander, Depew was the operations officer of the regiment, and he's with his boss, the new colonel. And the new colonel is looking at American soldiers, a mass of American soldiers, and says, "Oh, which battalion is that, Bill?" And Bill said, "Sir, that's not a battalion. Those are your replacements." In other words, hundreds of men were killers. They couldn't shoot straight. Their corporal didn't know their names. They were in contact with the Germans, who were just the best soldiers in Europe. By the way, that's a statement that's made by the Brits, the Americans, and everybody else. The German soldier was just the best soldier in Europe. And as a matter of fact, the British have a saying that is, if you haven't fought the Germans, you don't know war. They were good. They were good. And we weren't. But we got better. We got better and until the immediate phases of the war. We probably had the best army in the world at the end of the war. But a lot of people died to get us that way.
Yes, sir. You spoke of the relief of the field grade officers during World War II. One of the most controversial ones was the relief of General Terry Allen and General Ted Roosevelt at Rowena during the Battle of Sicily.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
My take is Terry Allen and Roosevelt were super duper combat commanders, hard drinking, hard cussing, tough guys that didn't fit the mold, went overboard sometimes, said stupid things. We can say the same thing about Patton. Patton had his place. Thank God he wasn't in Eisenhower's job or in Marshall's job. He was doing what he did, and that's just fine. My take on, by the way, Terry Allen got another division later on. That was done during the Second World War. A guy would be relieved, and it would have been great. It might get a second shot. You want to follow up?
One other question on General Depew. His leadership in Vietnam, when he commanded the 1st Infantry Division, there was some criticism that he was pushing Westmoreland's body count, and he ended up getting the Black Lions regimental commander killed because he was pushing him into the field.
I didn't really get all the questions, but I got the Westmoreland part. Dupuy was Westmoreland's operations officer before he took the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division. I would submit to you that Dupuy was pretty much the brains of that operation under Westmoreland. I've been very critical I was more critical of Westmoreland 20, 30 years ago than I am now. He was a Cavalier, Southern gentleman, Carolinian, South Carolinian. I don't think he was the sharpest pick in the toolkit. There have been biographies, a recent biography of him done just last year. During the Q&A, the author was asked a question about Westmoreland, and the response was, the question was, my uncle or my cousin or somebody served under Westmoreland Airborne Division in the United States, that he was just the greatest division commander imaginable. He'd jump up on a jeep, the troops loved him. And the fellow who wrote the critical books said he had reached his level of competence. He was a very good division commander, but not so good as commander of major forces. Westmoreland thought a lot of Dupuy protected him. It was through his influence that he got the Big Red One. It was because of the way he led the Big Red One that the Chief of Staff of the Army didn't have a job for him. Dupuy wanted Fort Benning. He wanted the Infantry Training Center. He didn't get it. Westmoreland intervened and saw that he went to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he wasn't in the Army chain of command. He was working for chairman of JCS. Did a super job. When the field cleared again, he was back in the Army staff and moved up to 4 stars, became the first straight out commander. And in my opinion, it's in the book, he fixed the broken U.S. Army, which of course has to be refixed every time. I mean, that's another, yes. When the editors and I debated the title of my book, they wanted what we have. Authors always lose. If you don't know that, authors lose, publishers win. General Wavy Dupuy, Preparing the Army for Modern War. I said, no. My title is Preparing the Army for War. No, modern is one of those words, it's a buzzword. Our salespeople tell us modern is good stuff, sexy. I don't know, it's a rip-off. You want modern. I said, I don't want it. Tell me what modern is. And I defy anybody to tell me what modern is. The Dupuy is convinced it takes constant attention, it's never right, it's never fixed, the Army's never done. You always have to retrain and regroup, accustom yourself to new gear, new people, new circumstances, new kinds of war. And the modern thing just doesn't belong in the title, but they want it. Buy the book anyway.
Somebody else? A couple more? We'll let you go home by about 12.
Fire away, I like it.
In the Army Green Book, Organization of the Army Ground Forces, General Leslie McNair at one point was looking at a 200-plus division army. Now, we know there's resource and manpower limitations, but it went down to 89. And
we couldn't even fill the 90th, which was the target.
And the thoughts were that, well, we had just enough. But considering some of the problems as far as how thin the strategic reserve was in the fall of 44, did we have enough, or were we short of about 5 or 10 divisions?
I'm afraid I didn't get that last part.
Did we have enough, or were we are we short of about 5 or 10 divisions?
That's what you think is enough. If you're an American, you want to put people in uniform who are not only warm and mobile, but within 18 and 35 years of age and so forth and so on. If you're a Russian, if you're a German, you've seen pictures of Hitler patting that boy on the face. You think it's a 14-year-old with a Mauser or a Panzerfaust that's bigger than he is. The Germans managed to have 300, Germany had 300 divisions. We couldn't fill the 90th division. It has to do with whether it's morality or ethics or values or prosperity or Christianity or whatever it is. We don't send grandpas back to war. We don't send boys out in a losing effort. Do you realize that in April of 1945, there were 10,500 American KIAs. April of 45, a week or two before the war stopped, and it was over. It had been over for months. But the Germans didn't know that. Hitler didn't know that. He just kept fighting. And so we're dealing now with a national character. My father was in his middle 30s and had 3 kids. And his job was considered semi-essential, so he never went on. A lot of others who were, fit 35-year-old men didn't go on because they had children or some kind of a job, perhaps. But the Russians wouldn't hesitate to put a grandmother in uniform if it was necessary. It's just the way they do things. And so you're asking me to make a value judgment. Sure, we could have scraped up 100 divisions, 110 divisions. Well, we would have had to take younger and older people. You can take 16, 17-year-olds who love it, and they'd be stupid enough to want to do it. But we didn't do that. Even through our history, at the age of 17, you need mom's permission to enter the U.S. military. So that's our character. That's where we are. Sure.
You talk about the casualties during winter. Why was the Army so ill prepared for the weather conditions? Was that the general's fault? Was that
I'm sorry, I told my wife, this may be the last time I do this. I can't get the question.
You talked about how heavy the casualties were due to the cold and weather. Was that the general's fault, or was that the planning back in the United States?
No, it was a terrible, terrible winter. I called it brutal, cold and wet. Some of you may remember that from the combat boot, we went to something called the shoe pack. It was a kind of a padded thing that was about 3/4 of an inch thick. I don't know if any of you experienced that. That arrived in Europe on the feet of the replacements. That's the way a lot of stuff is brought into combat, by the way. You bring in a couple of uniforms and boots so when you get shot or something, your stuff is still there. The shoe packs came in late. Some of you may remember the Mickey Mouse boots we had in Korea, insulated boots. The logistics system had a hell of a time keeping up with the advance. There were fuel situations and difficulties. You've heard about the Red Ball Express and all that sort of thing. I don't know where to put the finger of blame on God or American generals. I think they probably share the responsibility.
Anybody else? What a surprise.
2 questions, one on Lindbergh and one on Truman.
Lindbergh.
Right. I think for Americans to understand that period leading up to our entry in the war, Lindbergh was such a controversial, he was a national hero, holder of the Medal of Honor, one of the few civilians to get that first United flight across the Atlantic. But he leads that America First program and ticks off Roosevelt so bad that Roosevelt refuses to activate him, bring him back into the service. And you know what he does? He flies combat, shoots down 2 Jacks as a civilian.
That's alleged. I don't know that he did that, but that's it.
Now, I've tried to do that now looking at combat records, because McDonald gets Lee was sent back, right? But looking at, I was studying the Luftwaffe's aspect when he comes over and visits them. Lindbergh, would you say that his inspection tour, what he saw, what Goering allowed him to see it in new aircraft, and then the numbers, which he fiddled with, he went out to that airfield outside Berlin, at Döberitz, which Yaki Schreier H. He Then the next day, they flew them down to another airfield, and those planes were the same aircraft that were flown down and repainted. But do you think that tour, when he saw how well Germany was being rearmed and re-equipped in our attitude, that influenced him greatly about, we've got to stay out of this. There's no way we can match them if Roosevelt didn't change his other policies.
We need a psychiatrist or a priest to help me now, because he was an odd duck for a long time. His father was the only guy who voted in Congress against entry into the First World War. His grandfather left Sweden with some kind of problem. I don't know if it was sex or a couple of wives or some such thing. Lindbergh, later in his life, had all kinds of sexual escapades as well. So we're dealing with an oddball creature, and a sane, civilized, charming man like Henry Gold can't imagine what makes a man like that tick. But he was kindly disposed toward Northern Europeans, no question about it. He liked Germans. That didn't make him a Nazi. He was opposed to American involvement with those dumb Europeans who just every 20 years have to kill one another, and he thought the Americans should opt out of it.
The other question we briefly discussed before the talk.
Wait, quick forward so I can hear it.
About Truman Smith and his relationship with Albert Badermeyer.
Yeah.
Did you
Badermeyer was a student at the Kriegs Academy in Berlin. They established a personal relationship as well. In the attaché racket, co-nationals, I was attaché in Bonn as a major and a lieutenant colonel. The fellows who were in the German forces around Germany were under my wing. I was kind of responsible for them, and we became friends as well. Similarly, Wedemeyer, who was a German speaker, Reich name as well, was thought highly of by the Germans. Now, Wedemeyer said of Smith, when Smith came down with diabetes and could not serve as a regimental division corps commander, probably would have been he was an infantry officer. He had commanded a battalion in the 27th Regiment in Hawaii, 1933-1935, right after he completed the Army War College course in 1933. Wedemeyer said Smith would have been an Eisenhower-like figure. Now, Wedemeyer has been accused of being full of BS too. He is another contentious figure who he's charged with sweetening his own bio, lying and being dishonest. He's kind of an object of strong feelings for him and against him. He had a distinguished career. He winds up a lieutenant general. He serves in China. He becomes the operations officer in the Pentagon as lieutenant general. Wedemeyer is another one of these guys I'm not quite sure about. There are people who say as Charles Kirkpatrick, a very good military writer, wrote The Victory Plan, in which Wedemeyer comes out like a rose. More recent authors have criticized Wedemeyer as a liar. How could I know?
Okay then. Colonel Cole, thank you so much for your experience. Your experience and your research could probably fill about 50 of those, and they have to have you come back and follow up. Thank you so much for sharing